Next on Link TV. Latin Pulse, news and analysis from Latin America as seen by Latin American media, followed by a panel discussion on the issues. Next on Latin Pulse, only on Link TV.
The following program is an original production of Link TV.
As thousands take to the streets of Venezuela in defense of a free press, the question is freedom of the press, a right or a privilege?
No vamos a permitir que este presidente nos siga atropellando.
And the violence that is permeating every corner of Latin America is threatening the stability of the region and the sanity of its people.
Necesitamos seguridad.
This and more next on Latin Pulse. Hello and welcome to Pulso Latino. I'm your host, Marcos Gutierrez. Our first topic tonight, people take to the streets in defense of a free press in Venezuela, where President Hugo Chavez is about to shut down an institution in Latin American media. Some say this is the beginning of the end for a free press in Venezuela.
Este gobierno ya comenzó la hegemonía en los medios de comunicación.
Others say the station is a threat to Chavez's Bolivarian revolution.
Es una actitud recurrente. Parecieran enemigos de la democracia, de la estabilidad y del pueblo de Venezuela.
A country polarized and some say about to be paralyzed by politics. There is fear in Venezuela that this is the first step towards clamping down on individual rights and the beginning of the end of democracy. Venezuela's Globovisión reports the media could be one of the first victims of this constitutional battle.
En el informe se ilustran 106 casos de violaciones a la libertad de expresión y 134 víctimas de estas violaciones. Los casos más frecuentes son de intimidación, agresión, amenaza y hostigamiento. Durante el año que pasó se registraron más violaciones, aunque disminuyó el número de casos.
En los casos que se están registrando están teniendo un mayor número de violaciones. Eso habla de una mayor intensidad en las agresiones o en las violaciones a la libertad de expresión.
Correa, director ejecutivo de esta organización, mostró preocupación por la impunidad que caracteriza estos casos. También se alerta sobre los precedentes para los expertos perjudiciales que se están sentando con el uso de la justicia para someter a los medios.
Ha creado un precedente a través del cual los tribunales pueden mandar a callar a cualquier persona, a todos los medios de comunicación y sin decirnos por qué.
The operating license of Radio Caracas television expired and President Chavez is not about to renew it, claiming the television station took an active part in the military uprising that almost toppled his government 2 years ago. The Organization of American States has now intervened on behalf of the station and its employees. But as we see in this report, Chavez remains defiant.
Si la OEA, después de todo lo que ocurrió aquí, llega a condenar a Venezuela, pues Venezuela se retirará de la OEA. Cuba se retiró y no se ha muerto, dijo Chávez. El presidente se refirió a la posibilidad de que Venezuela sea llevada ante la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos por violación a la libertad de expresión en el caso de la cadena televisiva RCTV y criticó a la Corte Interamericana por no haber hecho ninguna declaración sobre el golpe que lo desalojó del poder por 2 días hace 5 años. Esos organismos están deslegitimados. Gobiernos como los nuestros tenemos la legitimidad y la moral para denunciar esos atropellos, insistió. Chávez acusa a RCTV de haber participado en el golpe de 2002 e insiste en que no renovará la licencia de transmisión de la televisora que vence el próximo 27 de mayo.
In the meantime, Freedom House, a U.S.-based NGO, says Venezuela is one of the 2 countries in Latin America with no free press.
El informe Freedom of the Press 2007, Libertad de Prensa 2007, que propone una lista mundial de países categorizados de acuerdo a su respeto por la autonomía de los medios, asegura que Venezuela y Cuba son los únicos países de América Latina sin libertad de prensa. Venezuela, de acuerdo al informe, es el segundo país con menos libertad de prensa en América después de Cuba. El documento sostiene que hay más libertad de prensa en Irak que en Venezuela.
In spite of government efforts, support for Radio Caracas seems to be widespread. Globovisión reports that across Venezuela, people have turned to the streets protesting the government's decision to shut down the station.
Decenas de conductores pintaron en los vidrios de sus vehículos consignas a favor de RCTV y la libertad de expresión y salieron en caravana por las calles de Puerto La Cruz, Barcelona, Guanta y Lechería.
Nosotros tenemos que seguir libres, somos libres, queremos que nuestra gente piense y escoja el canal que él quiere ver.
El pueblo no concibe esa decisión tan infame del gobierno nacional de pretender quitar la concesión a un medio que es del pueblo venezolano.
Aseguran que el pueblo está restiado con el canal pionero de la televisión venezolana.
Vamos a seguir en la lucha, no vamos a permitir que este presidente nos siga atropellando a ustedes los periodistas, a nosotros como venezolanos.
Anzoatiguenses anunciaron que en el marco de la ley realizarán nuevas acciones de calle en respaldo a Radio Caracas, televisión. Engler García, El Observador.
The government of Hugo Chavez, meanwhile, insists that the use of the airwaves is a privilege that has been abused by what he calls the Venezuelan oligarchy.
En la Asamblea Nacional no causó sorpresa la demanda de la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos contra el Estado venezolano por el caso RCTV. La presidenta del Parlamento los acusa de estar parcializados y de manipular una decisión que es soberana del gobierno venezolano.
Que esta Comisión Interamericana, que actúa como vocero de los sectores opositores de la derecha, del fascismo y del golpismo, ellos pudieran en este momento también tomar un pronunciamiento en favor de la paz y para erradicar lo que es el terrorismo.
Cilia Flores advirtió a la Corte Hemisférica que no podrán con Venezuela y agrega que digan lo que digan, en el país hay plena libertad de expresión.
Nosotros no le tememos a ninguna resolución de la Comisión Interamericana porque aquí hay una realidad en donde quisiéramos ver a esta Comisión Interamericana sancionando, investigando o de cualquier forma denunciando lo que es el cierre en otros países de canales donde sí se cierran canales.
With us tonight in our studio to explore this issue is Lidia Chavez, professor of journalism at UC Berkeley, and Ted Lewis, human rights director at Global Exchange. They're here in the studio. In Washington, D.C., we have Rick Rockwell, professor of communication at American University in Washington, and Jeff Thale, who is a program director at the Washington office of Latin America, obviously in Washington. Now, Latin America doesn't have a very clean record when it comes to free press. What is so different in this particular case, would you say, Ms. Chavez?
Well, I think it's Chavez, and I think that makes it different and gives everyone is looking at what Chavez does. I would say that I'm amazed that the TV station kept its license for so long, given the part that it played in the coup. The thing that actually concerns me more in Latin America is what is going on in Mexico with the journalist Stein covering the drug wars, many more attacks on journalists there, and then, you know, the concern also in Colombia. There was a report from an AP reporter who said, we just assume that all of our conversations are taped. So to me, that's much more
And that's interesting because next to Iraq and Mexico is where most of the journalists are dying. Now, getting back to Venezuela, does this mean the end to free press and freedom of expression, or is it just a tactic to put pressure on Chavez, Senor?
Well, I think that, you know, Chavez is clearly settling accounts with people who tried to help overthrow him during the coup. As Lydia said, it's very surprising that a station that actually engaged in treasonous activity, was defined as treasonous activity, has lasted this long. See, they've waited and gone constitutionally and legally. I don't think it means the end of the free press, and I agree with what Lydia said in terms of the real concern for the free press in Latin America is coming where the free market is actually the one that's restricting communication. If you look in Mexico, the Ley Televisa, which was passed under the pressure of the elections last year, has guaranteed a duopoly in Mexico. That means that no one can really get into the communication stream with any kind of alternative message. And if there's any place where you need real strong communications, it's in Mexico. So we see the free market actually, you know, so-called free market actually being a problem, and people don't talk about that in the same terms. The question of violence, as you mentioned, more journalists killed in Mexico during a wave of violence, in which 1,000 people in Mexico have been killed in a wave of narco violence since the beginning of the year. So these are the things that are putting the damper on the free press and what we really ought to be looking at.
Rick Rockwell, professor of communication at American University in Washington. Why should we be concerned here in the United States about free press in Latin America?
Well, we do business in Latin America, and I think as we do business, as we try to set an example for democracy in Latin America, that we should be concerned about those things, because if we are in this hemisphere as neighbors, if our neighbors don't have good conditions for free press and democracy, then I think we need to be concerned as good international neighbors. And I have to agree with your panelists. Mexico and Colombia have real concerns for the journalists and their safety in those countries. But to get back to Venezuela, there's also a real concern there. The Chavez government has been after journalists since 1999, 12 cases of major criminal defamation. They've strengthened their desacato, the disrespect laws. There have been almost 40 cases of journalists attacked since Chavez has been president. So this is just one more item, the closing of RCTV. Now, I agree that they took part in a coup, but there were other networks that were also part of that, and it becomes a question of equity. Why is this network being singled out and those other networks not being dealt with?
Well, now, should we be playing the role of the police officer in Latin America? Should we be imposing, make sure that freedom of the press exists in Latin America? I'd like to ask Jeff before we come back here to the studio in San Francisco.
Yeah, thanks. That's actually a good question. I mean, for a long time, the U.S. has tried to play the policeman for Latin America, and I don't think that's a helpful role or a useful role. I don't think the question here is trying to impose on Venezuela. I think the opposite. But I do think that we ought to, we have a point of view, and it's legitimate to express concern about democracy and democratic institutions. The truth is the United States hasn't done enough of that in Latin America, and it's done more trying to impose its views about business and trade relations.
First of all, it's just absurd to say that we're talking about a freedom of the press issue and a democracy issue. We were talking about a democracy issue when there was a coup happening in Venezuela that this television station took part in. I mean, we should be concerned about that. That's an issue.
Yeah, and I'm kind of an absolutist about free press issues. I'd like to see Chavez leave all these TV stations open. But if ever there was a case where the government has some legitimacy in saying that's it, I think that this is it, and it's hard for me to really get up on a high horse about this. It seems hypocritical, especially when we're not addressing the issues of press freedom elsewhere in the hemisphere, which are in many ways more serious.
So you do agree that that we should be concerned as Americans, as U.S. citizens, in how the press is dealt with in Latin American countries?
Well, we should be concerned with it in our own country, in the United States, and we should be concerned with it elsewhere, because that's how the free flow of information happens.
Yeah, we should also be concerned about how, wait a minute, we should also be concerned about how we cover here in the United States these issues of what is happening in Latin America. And to frame this as an issue over free press, frankly, it's inaccurate.
I think that Rick and Jeff has something else to say.
I strongly have to disagree that this is truly a free press issue. A number of human rights groups, most free press groups internationally have talked about this as a major issue. If we look at the Committee to Protect Journalists, they have an 8-point plan for how the Venezuelan government could do this in a different way. And I think some of us would like to propose that if there's not an equity issue, if they're not going to also close down Venevisión and some of the other networks that participated in the coup, instead of just singling out one network, then maybe what they should do is try this 8-point plan from the Committee to Protect Journalists for a year or two as a transition stage until we can figure out if that network should truly be closed, and why aren't the other networks also being held to the same accountability?
It's amazing to me that and that they would follow our, plan, our 8-point plan. This is a country, a government, and from here saying what they should do, that's just ridiculous.
No, pardon me, but it's not a U.S. plan.
Okay.
The Committee to Protect Journalists is an international group.
I know it's an international group.
Well, then please, it's not a Bush plan. There are other groups, other international groups, press freedom groups, Reporters Without Borders, other groups that have asked for this to be reconsidered. Even Amnesty International has stepped in and said maybe this should be reviewed. So if you look at the human rights groups that are lined up on the other side of this, it's not a question of...
What I see here is that indeed this is an important issue for Venezuelans to work out. But the crowd that has jumped onto this particular issue is not dealing with the issues of restricted press freedoms elsewhere in the hemisphere. So I see there's a little bit of hypocrisy that's going on. And while this isn't a Bush plan, we know that it comes in the context of Bush doing everything he can to undermine Chavez. And you know, that's also Bush's business, but I don't think human rights organizations have a lot of business getting involved in that.
To me, there's two different sets of questions. One has to do with press freedom in Latin America and what are kind of the major issues there. And I agree completely that Mexico and Colombia are really burning issues. If you ask specifically about the question of Venezuela, is Chavez in general putting pressure on the press, and is the RCTV case a matter of concern? I think the answer is yes. I think there's a very polarized debate in the U.S. about Venezuela, and we don't want to feed into that debate. But I think if you ask narrowly about the case, there are concerns to express about what the Chavez government's doing.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you for your input in this particular issue. Obviously, a hot topic that will continue on another program. When we come back, we'll explore the problem of violence in Latin American cities and why should this be of concern to us here in the United States. As we have seen here today and in previous episodes of Latin Pulse, Latin Americans in general are quick on the trigger when it comes to taking to the streets to protest against what they don't like. Violence is a huge issue nowadays around the world, and in particular in Latin America, where women are trying to take to the streets of Buenos Aires to protest against the lack of police protection for them and their neighborhoods, as we see in the following report from Argentina's Tele7.
Es un fierro que me tuve que preparar para salir a la noche a esperar a mis hijos cuando vienen de trabajar y cuando vienen de estudiar. No es justo, necesitamos seguridad. La policía no nos puede dar respuesta, queremos la gendarmería.
La señora tiene en su poder un gas paralizante, ¿está obligada a tener esto?
Desgraciadamente yo salgo temprano y vuelvo tarde de casa y tengo que tener esto. Mi hija llega a las 11:30 del colegio y tengo que ir a buscarla con esto, porque nos roban permanentemente, nos pegan, nos tiran al piso, en cualquier lugar.
Bien, aquí hay una señora, por ejemplo, le vamos a mostrar, es algo que nos llama poderosamente la atención. Una señora con una pistola, un arma de fuego, es algo que es inaudito. Las mujeres con cadenas, la señora con esta espada, no se puede creer esto.
No se puede creer. Queremos más policías, queremos más policías. Si a mí me tocan un hijo, yo lo mato con esto.
Central America, on the other hand, is being overrun by gangs, most of them operating out of El Salvador. These Central American gangs have their roots in California, USA. Most of these gangsters immigrated in the 80s to the United States as children escaping the Civil War. Once here, they joined gangs as they were growing up mostly in the Los Angeles area.
Por eso tenemos que trabajar en conjunto. Nosotros creemos que como agencias federales, especialmente el FBI, podemos compartir algunas de las experiencias que nosotros hemos tenido en los Estados Unidos.
Now they are being deported, as most alien criminals are, back to their homeland.
Lo que ha pasado el año pasado yo lo calificaría de tsunami criminal. Eso es lo que hemos tenido el año pasado, un tsunami criminal. Porque de 1800, de repente, en menos de un año, se sube a 3000.
The governments of Central America recently held a summit trying to deal with the issue of gangs and violence on a regional basis, as we hear from this report for El Salvador's Canal 12.
La Corte Centroamericana de Justicia dijo que la región debe trabajar en la legislación conjunta, como el Tratado de Extradición Centroamericana y la figura de la captura regional.
Los centroamericanos tenemos que ir dando pasos concretos hasta llegar a una policía regional centroamericana que no tenga fronteras. El primer paso de eso es este tratado de extradición y de captura centroamericana, el cual yo invito a todos los diputados de El Salvador para que lo ratifiquen lo más pronto posible, porque esto va a ser el primer paso para construir un sistema de seguridad regional.
Nosotros en el
en el esquema de seguridad pública debe tener una prioridad muy grande el elemento de la prevención, y ahí está el tema de Nicaragua, que se sustenta principalmente en la organización del pueblo y en la prevención social.
Mexico, on the other hand, has chosen to deal with criminals as traitors and enemies of the country, as we see in this report from Latinoamérica TV.
El mandatario indicó que quienes se alían a la delincuencia organizada traicionan a México y a su pueblo, y expuso que las Fuerzas Armadas seguirán en el primer frente en esa lucha. Son enemigos quienes tratan de envenenar el cuerpo y alma de nuestros niños y jóvenes con las drogas y la violencia, por lo que hoy coludirse con quienes atentan contra la seguridad del pueblo es traicionar a nuestro México, nuestra historia y futuro, apuntó Calderón.
Mr. Teo, what part does the U.S. play in this violence that seems to be out of control in some parts of Latin America?
Well, in Central America, we've actually played a significant role. I mean, gang violence has been around in Central America and in the United States and in all of the region for a long time. But the wave of Salvadorans and Hondurans and Guatemalans who came to the U.S. in the 80s, and especially to L.A., moved into neighborhoods that were heavily, had serious gang problems of their own. The two big gangs in Central America today were formed in L.A., not in Central America. And it's deportations from the United States in the mid-90s that really sort of trigger the massive growth of violent youth gangs in Central America in that period.
When you look at what is one of the great engines of violence in Mexico and in Central America as well, it is the drug trade. And one of the ways that the United States, not directly but indirectly, is responsible for that is that as a country we haven't come to grips with the issues of consumption, either through a social consensus around legalization or doing something serious about the consumption issues. Meanwhile, Mexico becomes a trampoline and a production point for drugs coming into the United States, and it's fueling a social crisis that's taken the lives of over 1,000 people since the beginning of the year. So these are questions that we're intimately involved in and that we have some power to influence. We need to get in there and work on these issues, especially the questions in the United States of consumption, our inability to, as a society, come to grips with how do we deal with our drug addictions.
The level of violence in Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador is tremendous. And it's not only gang violence, it's violence from every sector. You talk to poor people, you talk to wealthy people, you talk to students, everyone nearly has experienced violence. Complete impunity. I mean, we were supposed to build democracies in Central America, and what we left behind is a wasteland in which it's almost a national policy. It's so odd to be in Central America because we're having this huge immigration debate here about not wanting immigrants, more immigrants. Down there, that is everyone's plan. Everyone is coming up here.
And we have some comments from Washington. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I really want to follow up on that. I think a couple of big comments. One, I really agree that violence in Central America is a spectrum, and people talk about gangs and gang violence, and that's a serious problem for people in the street in poor neighborhoods, but it's only one part of the whole spectrum of violence, from domestic violence on the one side to organized violence and drug trafficking on the other. And I agree with Ted that on the drug trafficking issue, there's a big piece of U.S. responsibility in terms of our consumption and our demand for drugs. And on the Central American side, just a sort of final point, say, when we talk about gangs, I think it's really important to understand that although gangs in Central America are involved in street-level drug sales, drug trafficking is run by a whole another set of cartels and operators who have much higher level political and police connections that enable them to do that. It's not MS-13 and 18th Street who are doing that, but it's the cartels and people with political connections.
And what about
if I could add just two things before we move on. It's just to add to the idea of the cartels and some things that Ted brought up, and also to connect some things from our first segment. The amount of people killed in Mexico in the past 2 years dealing with drug violence, we're not just talking about journalists, we're talking about everyday people, all sections of society, outnumbers the amount of U.S. troops that have been lost in Iraq. This is something that's not talked about in this country, but yet it's right there on our border, and we're responsible because of these consumption matters. To get back also to what Lydia was talking about, this goes back to the fact that after the Central American wars that the United States helped foment in many ways in Honduras and Guatemala and other places, the United States did nothing to really step in and deal with violence and arms after those Central American wars, and this really is the upshot.
Well, it's not, I mean, the United States just cannot step into these countries and start dealing with things. I mean, these are, you know, countries. But I think one thing that happened are all these promises to sort of build up a judicial system, build up a police, build up the investigation capabilities of all of these institutions that we sort of helped create through the peace agreements. None of that happened. I mean, if you look at U.S. aid to all these countries after the Central American, it's like this. It just takes a dive right after the war's end, instead of remaining and doing and following through on some of the promises that we made.
It's the idea that the United States isn't there to dictate, but is there to help build democracy. We're failing at that now in the Middle East. We failed at doing that in Central America too, and it is through working in a multilateral way with those countries to do those things with those institutions.
I wanted to introduce the idea of the political parties utilizing this gang problem for political leverage. Is one of you able to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can talk about that. I mean, if you look at Salvador in particular, both of the last two presidential elections, the winning candidates built their platform around combating gangs and gang violence. And the first of them campaigned on a program called Mano Dura, Iron Fist Policies. And the second one campaigned on a program called Super Mano Dura. So it's this sort of right-wing populist take. You're not feeling secure. I'm going to play up on that, and I'm going to get your vote to crack down hard. Well, all the evidence is it doesn't work. I mean, homicide rates in Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala have gone up every single year since they instituted Mano Dura and Super Mano Dura policies. But it continues to be politically a really popular thing to do.
And this was also a political issue in Honduras, too.
Yeah. You know, I think you're absolutely right about the Mano Dura policies, but another thing that can be looked at is the wealthy in these countries do not pay any taxes. They don't pay any taxes in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, so that there is no money in the bank to improve any of these services, and the government holds responsibility. I mean,
now, if you look at Mexico once again, you know, Felipe Calderon ran on the Mano Firme program, and now he's cracking down and trying to build up his weakened legitimacy on the basis of the army attacking the drug gangs. So this is clearly a political tactic.
Now, what can we do to help, and why should we? I'd like to have Mr. Jeff Theo possibly address this issue. What can we do?
Sure. One really concrete thing we can do is all of the evidence in this country is that what works in dealing with gang violence is community-based approaches that emphasize prevention, and approaches that emphasize coordination between the police and schools and social service agencies. There are successful models of that, you know, in communities in LA and in Houston and in Boston and around the country. It would be a lot more productive if we were encouraging Central American governments to look at that, and if we were encouraging exchange between the successful prevention programs in LA and programs in San Salvador, rather than focusing on strengthening, you know, hardline police tactics with Chief Bratton.
This is all the time we have. I trust you enjoyed today's program. I'd like to thank our guests, Jeff Theo, Program Director at the Washington Office of Latin America, and Rick Rockwell, Professor at the School of Communication, American University in Washington, D.C. And here in our studios, Lidia Chavez, Professor of Journalism at UC Berkeley, and Ted Lewis, Human Rights Director at Global Exchange. I would also like to thank you at home or in the web for being with us today. We would also like to thank American University in Washington, D.C. and the students at the Communications Department who are helping with the research for this particular program. And join us next week and at the same time when we take a closer look at Latin America through the eyes of Latin American media. For more information about Pulso Latino and Latin American, log on to linktv.org. My name is Marcos Gutierrez. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time here on Latin Pulse.
Latin Pulse was made possible thanks to the generous contribution from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Pulso Latino ha sido posible gracias a la generosa contribución de la Fundación John D. y Catherine T. MacArthur.
This program is brought to you by Link TV for educational and non-commercial use only. Link TV is the only U.S. network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs. Programs that connect you to the world.